Good evening all, and welcome back to our channel. Tonight we bring you 5 most disturbing true horror stories from New York City. New York City, 8 million people stacked beneath a skyline of steel and shadow, a place that never sleeps, a place that never slows. And yet, inside this restless giant, there are moments, dark, quiet moments when something unspeakable slips through the cracks. Stories whispered in subway tunnels, tragedies buried under concrete, footsteps echoing in hallways long after the living have gone. Most people know the city for its lights, but tonight you're going to meet its darkness, not the kind found in ghost tours or tabloid headlines. No, these stories are real. They happen to real people, on real streets, under the same neon glow millions walk beneath every day. Stories that have scarred neighborhoods, shaken communities, and carved themselves permanently into the bones of New York. Some of these horrors were caught on camera. Some were witnessed by dozens, and some have never been fully explained. So before we begin, before we open the door to the 5 most disturbing true horror stories this city has ever witnessed, take a moment to prepare yourself. And if you're brave enough to keep going, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Because trust me, what you're about to hear is only the beginning. Now, take a deep breath. Let's step into the dark side of New York City. I still remember the heat of that July afternoon, the way it pressed against the city like an unspoken warning. People forget that New York has its own kind of summer silence, a heaviness that rolls through the boroughs, softening the edges of noise until everything feels just a little too still. You can live here your whole life and never sense it, or you can notice it once and never unhear it again. I noticed it that week, long before the news broke, long before the helicopters circled above Borough Park, long before the prayer lines formed along the sidewalks. Something in the air had shifted. I felt it like a ripple beneath the surface of everyday life. I didn't know then what it meant, only that something terrible had found its way into the current of the city. People ask why this case clings to me. Why, out of all the horror stories New York has hosted, this one refuses to fade into the background noise of memory. The answer is always the same. Because it was the moment I realized that horror doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes it comes from the streets we trust, the faces we pass without suspicion, the corners where a child might innocently wait for help. That week, a boy named Leiby Kletzky walked home alone for the first time. And I have replayed the story of that walk more times than I want to admit, not because I knew him, I didn't, but because the city did, because every parent, every neighbor, every person who has ever taken comfort in the idea of community felt something fracture when he disappeared. I first heard the news the evening it began. The sun was still up, heavy and indifferent in the sky, and Borough Park was buzzing with the kind of panic that spreads fast in tight-knit neighborhoods. A child missing, 8 years old, last seen on his walk home from day camp. The words hit like a jolt. I felt them in my chest even though missing person flyers are nothing new in New York. But this wasn't a name taped to a lamppost. This wasn't a runaway or a custody dispute. This was a child who had stepped into the fabric of a routine so ordinary it should have been unbreakable. And yet, somewhere along those familiar blocks, the routine split open. I went there the next morning, not because I planned to join the search, but because I couldn't stop thinking about that silence I'd felt earlier in the week. Something had settled in my stomach, something that told me this wasn't going to unfold the way missing child stories sometimes do, with a tearful reunion and a relieved mother pulling her son into her arms. No, this one felt wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, only sense. By then, the search had already grown massive. Volunteers poured out in waves. Dozens became hundreds, hundreds became thousands. Flyers spread across Brooklyn like a second skin. Police officers combed through surveillance footage, every second examined as though one frame might hold the key to rewinding the nightmare. And then there was the footage, grainy, muted, unremarkable except for the moment it captured Leiby walking with a man. A stranger. The boy looks calm, trusting. The man gestures casually. The city froze. I've seen that footage so many times, the images have become part of my mind's architecture. Each replay digs a little deeper, carving a hollow space where understanding should be but never is. People say hindsight makes everything clearer, but hindsight only sharpens the ache. You look at the two of them, an innocent boy and a man whose name no one yet knows, and you want to scream through the screen as though some fragment of sound could cross the barrier of time and reach him. But time, as always, is indifferent. The man was Levi Aaron, though that name meant nothing to anyone until the moment police traced the footage back to him. I didn't know him, most people didn't. He was ordinary in the way that unsettles you once you learn what he was capable of. A man who lived a quiet, unremarkable life, worked, kept to himself, blended into the background the way predators sometimes do, not by hiding, but by being painfully, perfectly normal. When the police reached his home, they expected answers. What they found was horror. I didn't see the apartment. I only heard what was reported later, the smell of chemicals, the refrigerator, the unimaginable discovery inside. Even now, repeating the details feels like reopening a wound the city never fully allowed to heal. Because the truth of what happened to that boy is not just brutal, it's incomprehensible, even to those who claim to understand the hearts of monsters. When news of Leiby's fate broke, I was standing in line at a corner store. I remember the moment perfectly, not because of what I was doing, but because of what happened around me. The cashier stopped mid-sentence. The man beside me dropped his bottle of water. A woman behind us let out a sound so soft and broken it didn't seem human. It was as though the city itself exhaled in grief. In the days that followed, the narrative twisted into questions. People wanted motives, explanations, a reason that could make sense of the senseless. But the truth is that some acts sit outside the reach of reason. Some horrors don't come with warnings or logic or even intention that can be dissected. They are ruptures, sudden and violent, tearing through lives without pattern. And the most terrifying part? They can come from anyone. I remember walking through Borough Park a week after the funeral. The streets were quieter, but not in the way they had been the week before. This silence was heavier. It carried the weight of something lost, not just a child, but the illusion of safety that had wrapped itself around the neighborhood like a protective blanket. Parents walked with their children close, hands gripped tight. Every passerby was observed, evaluated, silently measured against some newly formed internal scale of trust. The city had changed. But what stayed with me wasn't the crime itself. It was the shattering of something fundamental, the belief that the world, though flawed, followed some set of invisible rules. That children were safe in familiar neighborhoods, that danger had a face, a warning, a shape we could recognize. Leiby's story proved otherwise. I sometimes think about his walk, that simple, ordinary walk, and how every horror story begins with something ordinary. A decision that feels small, a moment that feels harmless, a turn on a street that's been walked 1,000 times before. I think about the surveillance footage, about the trust on that boy's face, and I think about the man beside him. There is a part of New York that never recovered from that week. It lives in the way parents watch their children more closely now, the way strangers meet each other's eyes with a flicker of suspicion, the way something fragile and unspoken was taken and never returned. Sometimes horror doesn't lurk in the shadows at all. Sometimes it walks in daylight, sometimes it smiles, and sometimes it asks for directions. New York, in the summer of 1976, held a kind of pressure that settled into the bones of the city. It was a summer cracked open by heat, by blackouts, by tension that grew in the unlit corners of neighborhoods already strained by crime and fraying trust. Yet beneath all of that, something else stirred, something colder, something that moved through the boroughs with no pattern, no reason, no mercy. It waited behind the quiet hum of streetlights, behind the laughter spilling from late-night bars, behind the ordinary rhythm of lives unaware they were walking toward history. It began quietly. A shooting reported in the Bronx. A couple targeted as they sat in their car, the kind of crime that was tragic but far from unusual. New York had learned to stomach these things, to fold them into the nightly news cycle, to absorb the shock as one more statistic carved into the city's skin. But the bullet casings told their own story, one that no one yet knew how to read: a small caliber weapon, a shooter who approached with chilling proximity, a survivor who remembered nothing but the explosion of light and pain. It would take time for the city to realize that this was not the end of something, but the beginning. The newspapers didn't latch onto it at first. The city was too busy with its own unraveling financial collapse, rising crime, a blackout that would soon shatter the illusion of order. But the killer waited patiently in the spaces between headlines. On a warm night in Queens, he struck again. Another couple, another car, another scene left behind like a signature etched into tragedy. This time, the pattern began to sharpen. The shooter targeted couples, always young, often parked, always unaware that death was stepping toward them beneath the veil of night, holding a double way. .44 caliber revolver with the calmness of someone for whom killing had already become ritual. He moved with purpose, though no one yet knew what that purpose was. Victims were chosen without personal connection. They were symbols, pieces in some silent logic unfolding inside the man who watched them through the gun's long barrel. New York was not yet afraid, but the police were beginning to notice. Ballistics matched the bullets. A connection formed. The killings were not random. They belonged to one person, one hand carrying out a sequence that made no demands, left no threats, offered no explanation. A pattern with no face. Then came the letter. It was discovered near another crime scene, written in a tone so disturbingly casual that even the seasoned detectives who read it felt unease settle beneath their ribs. The writer called himself the Son of Sam. He wrote as though he were already a legend, as though he believed the city belonged to him, as though the fear he intended to spread was merely an extension of his will. He promised more blood. He promised more nights shattered by gunfire, and he wrote with an intimacy toward violence that suggested he had already crossed a threshold from which he had no desire to return. The newspapers devoured it. Headlines screamed the moniker across every borough. New Yorkers read the words with a mixture of fascination and terror. A killer had given himself a name, something the city could hold, something it could fear more efficiently. But what the letters did more than anything else was make the killer feel present, not a shadow, not a rumor. A voice speaking directly to the people he hunted. Women cut their hair short, brunettes dyed their hair blonde. Couples stopped parking in cars at night. Bars emptied earlier. The city adapted to survival in a way it had not done in years. And still, he killed. He watched them before he approached. He studied their routines with the patience of a predator who believed the city was his territory. Cars offered no safety. Light offered no safety. The presence of other people offered no safety. He killed quickly, efficiently, then disappeared into the night as though the darkness wrapped itself around him willingly. Witnesses were rare. The mated descriptions were vague. A figure, a shadow, a man of average height. Nothing that could anchor him to reality. The police worked without sleep. Thousands of officers pored over reports, sifted through tips, interviewed witnesses, tracked down leads that dissolved the moment they seemed promising. The task force ballooned. The pressure grew. The city demanded answers, demanded resolution, demanded protection. But the killer thrived on that tension. He kept moving. He kept killing. And then another letter arrived. This one was addressed to a newspaper columnist, written with the same unsettling mix of arrogance and playful cruelty. The killer taunted the city, taunted the police, taunted anyone who believed justice was within reach. He created a mythology around himself, weaving his identity into something larger than a man, something monstrous, something that felt omnipresent. The fear reached its peak. The summer of 1977 became synonymous with the killer's shadow. New Yorkers lived with the awareness that death could step out from behind any car, any alley, any moment of complacency. The son of Sam was no longer a criminal to them. He was a phantom woven into the fabric of their nights. But even phantoms leave footprints. The final shooting carried the detail that would break the case open. A witness saw something, a car, a license plate partially remembered. A chain reaction of events triggered from one moment of clarity, leading detectives through days of tense, meticulous investigation until a single name surfaced: David Berkowitz. A man whose life seemed unremarkable, whose presence in his neighborhood was so ordinary it bordered on invisible. But inside his apartment, police found the tools of a serial killer. Guns, letters, evidence that stitched itself unmistakably to the crimes that had sparked terror across the city for a year. He offered no resistance when they arrested him. He smiled. He seemed almost relieved, as though the weight of his own darkness had finally been noticed, acknowledged, confirmed. When asked why he did it, he spoke in riddles, demons, voices, a dog that commanded him. The explanations offered nothing. The truth was simpler and far more frightening. He wanted to kill, and he chose to do it in a way that made the world watch. The trial became another chapter in the city's long saga of violence, but the fear had already diminished the moment Berkowitz was led into custody. The phantom had become a man after all. The monster had a face, and the realization that he had always been just a man was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because he could be contained. Horrifying because it meant anyone under certain shadows of mind could become like him. New York began to heal, though healing looked different for everyone. Some slept more easily. Some never again sat in parked cars at night. Some carried the tension of that summer for the rest of their lives. The memory of the city's collective heartbeat pounding in time with the threat of a killer who had made them feel hunted in their own streets. But the story of the son of Sam was more than the story of a man with a gun. It was the story of how fear spreads, how it transforms, how it infiltrates the spaces people once believed were safe. It was the story of a city forced to confront the fragility of its own defenses. And most of all, it was the story of how a single individual, acting with no purpose beyond destruction, could paralyze millions. The mythology endures. The letters, the interviews, the chilling nonchalance of the man who inflicted so much terror, they all remain part of the cultural memory. Yet, beneath the sensationalism lies something quieter, more unsettling, the reminder that the veneer separating ordinary life from chaos is thin, and sometimes all it takes is one person to tear it open. The summers that followed were different. New Yorkers walked with more vigilance, more awareness of the world around them. The notion of random violence became a scar woven into the identity of the city. And though Berkowitz sits behind bars, serving life after life with decades stacked upon decades, the shadow of what he created lingers, because fear, once named, never fully disappears. It settles into the corners of memory, waiting to be awakened by the echo of a story retold. And the son of Sam left an echo strong enough to last generations. I grew up with the story of Cropsey like it was a weather pattern, something you learned to predict and fear without ever understanding the mechanics of it. We whispered it under blankets, traded versions on schoolyards, and watched our parents' faces change when the name came up. For us, Cropsey was never just a folktale. He was the sound of the island at night, a finger tapped against the window, a warning passed down like an heirloom. You learn young that the world holds things you cannot explain, and most frightening of all is when those things have names and addresses and faces that look, at first glance, like everybody else's. I remember the first time I heard the name properly, not as a dare but as a memory. An older cousin told me that Cropsey lived in the woods, that he dragged children underground and fed on the soft parts of the world that later generations forgot. She said it in a voice that made every hair on my arms stand up. I slept with the light on for a week. Later, when the news started whispering about a man in the old Willowbrook area, when mothers began locking their doors and not letting their kids walk to friends' houses alone, the story changed shape but not purpose. The myth found its flesh. It is funny how the mind stitches myth and flesh together. You think myth is safe because it belongs to stories, and then you realize how porous the line is. The tales we tell children are scaffolding for later horrors. You build your world on them, and when the scaffold creaks under real weight, when the urban legend that kept you cautious becomes the outline of an actual monster, you feel betrayed by the very stories that were meant to protect you. Cropsey, for us, was more than a story. He was a name adults used when they wanted children to stay close. He was that thing we blamed when a kid went missing from a block party or failed to return from the library. It was a nonsense scapegoat at first, a way to externalize the unforeseeable. But then the reports started. Missing children, strange behaviors in a mental institution on Staten Island, whispered links between an old ex-convict and the vanishing of kids along the shoreline. The city paper printed small, factual headlines that did not sound like the folktale I'd been told. The headlines made Cropsey feel less like a lesson and more like a pending sentence. I was older, old enough to read, old enough to make sense of the vocabulary adults used, and still the news consumed me. Names of missing kids read like the roll call of every child I'd ever known. Each name tugged at the edges of the myth until it loosened and became doubt. I began to stand in the place where legend and fact met, watching to see which would drown the other. The idea of a boogeyman hiding in the trees seemed childish now, but the edges of the adult world had grown sharper. There were faces now, and faces are harder to dismiss. People are eager to create monsters out of strangers. It makes us feel safer. If the world's horrors have a face, they can be jailed, exiled, canceled. But the moment the face is revealed, the stories we told ourselves in childhood fall apart. You realize the monster can sit in a city apartment, collect welfare, and talk to the mailman. That realization is the thing that burrows into your skull forever. I watched as the community's fear folded into suspicion. Parents became detectives. Neighbors measured each other like suspects. A quiet man with a dog became a subject of gossip. An ex-con who kept to himself became a repository for 1,000 whispered accusations. I never met the man they called Andre Rand until after his name started appearing in interviews and documentaries, until it was spoken on television as though saying it aloud might pull the story into focus. People liked the sound of his name with Cropsey because it completed the myth, the cruel laugh at the end of a tale. You could say his name and feel the old fear resurface, as though admitting that myth had a living counterpart gave the story new legitimacy. But I learned, in time, that names are blunt instruments. They cut, they label, but they also hide the messy middle. The community's own complicity, the failures of institutions, the waste of generations that allowed someone to fall through the cracks. At first, I believed the narrative the way I believe streetlights would keep shadows away. There were holes in the system, mental institutions closed, and their patients dispersed into neighborhoods, state care with mute bureaucracy, records filed and forgotten. It felt easy to imagine the tidy villain of legend filling the gaps that government and community left open. It was a story of negligence and malice conjoined, the perfect, terrible fit. We told ourselves the man they arrested was Cropsey incarnate, and in doing so we absolved ourselves of something else, the realization that the world had been hollowed out around the vulnerable. When the first arrests were made, they came with that peculiar mix of relief and revulsion. Relief, because the anxiety we had carried for months finally had a target. Revulsion, because targets are made of people, and people are messy. The news showed grainy photographs, faces lit by flashbulbs, hands cuffed in front of cameras. The moral clarity we wanted to feel, monster captured, evil contained, wasn't the truth. The truth kept leaking in the background, missing evidence, sloppy police work, rumors amplified into facts. People who lived near the skirts of Willowbrook remembered kids playing in backyards, stray dogs, broken fences. The story that had seemed so cut and dried in retellings became creased with complications. Some spoke with certainty, others held their tongues. I began, in those months, to keep a notebook. Perhaps that is what happens when you are trying to preserve the margin between myth and reality. You collect facts like shells, lining them up on a page and trying to make a pattern. The shells never fit perfectly. One article would contradict another. A witness would say something that later proved unreliable. Rumor metastasized into accusation faster than footage could be verified. I found myself reading transcripts of interviews, watching old clips, waiting for the edges to sharpen into proof, but the edges kept blurring. That, perhaps, is the cruelest thing about such stories. They thrive on uncertainty. An urban legend survives on not-quite truths, and when a real-life horror borrows its shape, the result is a hybrid that feeds on the community's worst instincts. In those days, the island felt like a pressure cooker of suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other like witnesses to sins. I learned to notice the way people dialed down their voices when the subject came up, as if lowering the volume might make the past less audible. I remember a woman at the deli who refused to look me in the eye when she told me about her niece. She was 7, the woman said, and the line in her forehead tightened. Just went to buy bread and the kid never came back. She brought out a photograph folded into a wallet, edges worn for being handled too often. In the picture, the child was smiling, unaware of how her image would be used to strike terror into a neighborhood. The woman laid the photograph between us like an offering, and I felt the weight of it as though it were made of lead. When she left, the owner of the deli muttered that it was probably the same fellow everyone feared, that Cropsey lived on in the way a city preserves its nightmares. You see that pattern again and again. People overlay the myth on the missing until they become indistinguishable. The missing child becomes an emblem, and the emblem is easier to rally around than the facts. The human face of loss simplifies into a symbol. Grief is tidy then, easier to carry without dissolving into accusation. It comforts people to think the same hand took every child to draw a straight line through chaos and pin the end to a single name. But life is rarely so neat. As the investigations unfolded, cracks in the official story widened. Evidence that might have exonerated people vanished. Witnesses contradicted themselves under pressure. The spotlight of the media distorted more than it revealed. For every thread that suggested a clean resolution, there were 10 that tangled and broke. The city's hunger for answers created its own monsters. People whose lives were altered not by acts they committed, but by fingers pointed in desperation. I watched as reputations were shredded, as families were torn apart by suspicion. And then there were the quieter ways the story settled into us. The walks home changed. Children walked in pairs. Parents held hands in different ways, not with affection only, but with a kind of vigilance that hardened the meat of ordinary days. The island's landscape, once benign and soft in our memory, became a map of potential danger. Places where we had once felt free now carried an electric charge. That fear is a physical thing. It rearranges your body to expect harm. You catch yourself calculating exits, options, plausible stories to tell if chalices of normalcy are shattered. Fear rewires you into survival. Years later, when documentaries and books tried to render the story in neat chapters, origins, arrests, trials, convictions, I watched with a mixture of interest and fatigue. I wanted to know the truth. I also suspected that the truth was not as consumable as the documentaries pretended. Editing compresses complexity into arcs. Producers choose angles that will hold viewers' attention. Nothing wrong with that as entertainment, but as history, it is insufficient. The human cost is messy and resists storytelling's tidy beats. I saw men whose names had been given to the myth, who suffered public shame and private ruin, and felt a pang of wrongness at how cleanly we had washed our hands. All of this is to say, when the authorities pointed to one man as the embodiment of the Cropsey myth, part of me wanted to believe. The idea of a monster in custody is desperately satisfying. You can exhale. You can hand your fear back to the system and let it file justice in neat envelopes. But deeper down, I understood that the story had outlived its need for a single scapegoat. Cropsey had been born out of a communal anxiety, and communal anxiety does not die because one person is taken away. Systems fail, neighborhoods hollow out, and myths fill the emptiness. In the years since, whenever a child's face appears in a missing person notice, I feel that old clamp of dread return. For me, Cropsey is not simply a recollection. It is a lens through which I see how stories and reality collide. It taught me to distrust the comfort of simple conclusions. It taught me that monsters are not always lurkers in dark places. Sometimes they are institutions that forget their charge, policies that abandon people before they are fully grown, neighbors who look away because confronting danger is inconvenient. I also learned, painfully, that fear can be weaponized. The folklore of Cropsey empowered vigilance, yes, but it also made it too easy to point at the wrong people. Suspicion, fed by rumor and reinforced by the suffering people cannot bear, becomes an instrument for grief's misdirection. When something monstrous happens, we need an answer not only to heal, but to understand. We prefer answers that fit the stories we have already told ourselves. Those answers are never as generous as the truth. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the island's distant hum rolls in my window, I think of the children whose faces I saw in that old collage of news clips. I think of the parents who kept vigil in hospital lobbies, who stood in alleys asking anyone who might have seen something to speak. I think of how easy it is to simplify their grief into a lesson about monsters and forget the harder one, that communities must be made robust enough that children do not fall through the seams. In the end, Cropsey lives in our memories because we let him, not as a monster made of shadow and teeth, but as a testament to our lapses. He is a mirror held up to a place that could have done better. If there is any penance to be paid, it is not in locking a single man behind a cell door and calling it closure. It is in rebuilding the structures that failed, caring for the vulnerable, funding institutions that offer real help instead of shuffling people off like old furniture, listening when a parent says their child is missing, and following that thread with the tenacity of someone who refuses easy answers. There are stories a city tells about itself, and stories a city tries to forget. The murder of Kitty Genovese became both at once an emblem of indifference and a wound carried forward through decades of argument, myth, guilt, and truth. To understand what happened to her is to confront not merely the violence of a single night, but the complicated machinery of human attention, fear, and responsibility. Kitty's death lingers not because of its brutality alone, but because of what people believed it revealed about the human heart. He was 28. She worked as a bar manager, lived in a modest apartment in Queens, and was described by those who knew her as lively, warm, the kind of person who could make even the city's cold mornings feel less intrusive. Her life was unremarkable in the way most lives are, textured by small joys and small burdens. For years, she lived without fanfare, another face among millions moving along sidewalks, waiting for buses, weaving through the churn of New York's restless rhythm. The city was not the city of polished glass and curated neighborhoods it would someday become. It was rougher, more porous, more ambiguous. Queens was a patchwork of small buildings and close-set lives, neighbors who saw each other more than they heard each other, who lived adjacent but not always connected. There were people who preferred privacy to community. There were others who watched everything from their windows, unseen behind curtains. There were sounds at night, arguments, laughter, breaking glass, that were as much a part of the landscape as taxis or subway announcements. New York, even then, asked its residents to develop a certain tolerance for intrusion. On the night Kitty Genovese died, most people who later spoke of her said they hadn't known her well. She was just someone they passed now and then, someone whose name they might not have known until they needed to remember it. And yet her story would draw them all into a spotlight they did not expect, changing their lives as much as it ended hers. It was after 3 in the morning when she parked her car and began walking toward her apartment building. The streets were mostly deserted, just the quiet hum of a city in the pause between midnight chaos and dawn's early stirrings. She knew her route, she'd taken it many times. It was not a reckless walk, just an ordinary one. But ordinary moments can become extraordinary in the wrong company. The man who followed her later told police he had gone out that night looking for someone to kill. Not a specific person, just someone. He had the detachment of a predator who believed the world existed to fill his appetite. Kitty became his target because she was alone, because he could reach her, because the calculus of opportunity outweighed every other factor in his mind. What happened next spread slowly across the neighborhood, a cry for help, the sound of a struggle, footsteps retreating and returning. The details have always been contested, reshaped by journalists, corrected by historians, debated by scholars who wanted to understand whether the city truly failed her. But in the moment itself, stripped of interpretations, Kitty was dying, and the world around her did not stop. In later retellings, people imagined a crowd of apathetic neighbors standing at their windows, refusing to intervene. That version became myth, an entire city painted as indifferent. But the truth, as always, was more fractured. Some heard something and could not interpret what it was. Some saw shadows, but could not discern their meaning. One man shouted from his window and briefly stopped the attack. Another called out to a friend, but did not investigate further. A few believed they were witnessing a lover's quarrel, a domestic dispute, something uncomfortable but not life-threatening. Others thought someone else had already called the police. The city had trained them, over years, to evaluate danger through the lens of survival. New Yorkers did not always rush toward noise, a fact that made them seem cruel when the story hit the newspapers, but for many, it was simply how they had learned to navigate a place that could turn violent without warning. Kitty's killer returned to her after the initial interruption, finding her in the shadowed entrance to the building. Her final minutes were marked by fear and struggle, but also by the smallest fragment of human connection, a neighbor who finally came down to the street, who held her as she lay bleeding, who stayed with her so she would not die alone. When the police arrived, too late to save her, they recorded the facts of the situation with clinical detachment. Another murder, another night's work, another loss that would be carried by a family rather than a city. But the city would carry this one. 2 weeks later, a newspaper article claimed that 38 witnesses had seen or heard the attack and done nothing. The number was wrong, the details inaccurate, and the conclusion misleading, but the narrative struck a chord. It told a story people were ready to believe, a story about apathy, about moral decay, about a metropolis too hardened to protect its own. Whether or not the article reflected the truth seemed to matter less than the fact that it captured an anxiety already embedded in the culture. Psychologists seized on the incident. It became the foundation of lectures, experiments, and theories. The bystander effect entered the vocabulary of human behavior, shorthand for the idea that individuals are less likely to intervene when others are present. Kitty Genovese's name became attached to a phenomenon she never knew and could not consent to represent. Her life disappeared behind the metaphor she had unwillingly become. Her family, meanwhile, mourned her in private, knowing that strangers were using her death to argue ideas that had nothing to do with the woman she truly was. Friends recalled her laughter, her relationships, her quick wit. But the world at large heard only the cautionary tale, a woman murdered while a city watched and did nothing. Over time, researchers pushed back against the original narrative. They found flaws in the reporting. They uncovered evidence that several neighbors had attempted to help in ways that were misunderstood or ignored. They showed that the number 38 was a fabrication and that the conditions of that night were far more nuanced than the sensational headlines had suggested. Yet the myth persisted because myths are sticky. They simplify, they clarify. They allow people to tell themselves that moral failure can be explained by one dramatic example, rather than by quieter, more pervasive forces. Kitty Genovese, the woman, faded beneath Kitty Genovese, the symbol. Still, even beneath the myth, something true remained. Fear does create paralysis. Confusion does breed hesitation. People are not as reliable as they hope to be in moments of crisis. The lesson, perhaps, was not that New Yorkers were indifferent, but that humans often struggle to interpret danger unless it is presented with absolute clarity. The tragedy lies in how often that clarity arrives only after it is too late. To speak of Kitty now is to navigate two parallel histories, the event itself and the world's long reaction to it. The first belongs to her, a woman whose life was singular and irreplaceable. The second belongs to all of us, shaped by the questions her death forced society to ask. In the decades since, reforms in emergency response systems have their roots in the wake of her story. People now speak more openly about intervention, about responsibility, about the dangers of assuming someone else will act. The tragedy of her death helped reshape the language of social obligation. It made communities reflect on their role in each other's safety. But it also left behind an uncomfortable truth: that horror does not always come from the brutality of a single act. Sometimes horror emerges from silence, from confusion, from misinterpretation, from moments in which people retreat into themselves, hoping someone else will step forward. Kitty's story has been told too often through the lens of accusation, but at its core, it is a story about fragility, the fragility of perception, the fragility of community, the fragility of the assumptions we carry about the world. It forces us to ask questions we may never answer cleanly. What would we have done? What would we have understood in the dark of that early morning? How do we measure our own courage against the echo of a scream? Time has marched on, but the ghost of that night remains. Not as a specter haunting the building where she fell, but as an echo in conversations about responsibility and humanity. Kitty Genovese did not ask to become an icon of moral philosophy. She wanted, by all accounts, a simple life shaped by work, friends, love. Yet she became something larger because the world chose to interpret her death as a symbol. Sometimes, symbols outlive the truth. But if there is something meaningful in remembering her, it is this: that attention matters. That presence matters. That human beings, even in a world as crowded and chaotic as New York, remain dependent on one another in ways that become obvious only in the most catastrophic moments. Kitty's name remains spoken not because of what she symbolizes, but because the questions she raised have not gone away. Every person who hears her story confronts the same challenge. When the world grows dark and uncertainty fills the air, will we understand what we are seeing? Will we act? Will we choose connection over fear? Her story is not an indictment of a city. It is a mirror held up to humanity now, and the reflection it reveals is one we are still learning to face without flinching. I never meant to stay long at the Chelsea. It was supposed to be one night, maybe two, just enough time to catch my breath before life swept me back into its usual rhythm. But the hotel had its own sense of time. Once you stepped inside, the outside world thinned, fading into something distant and unimportant. And the longer I stayed, the more I understood why people whispered about the place as if it were alive. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Not noise. New York has plenty of that. But sound. A kind of low, ever-present murmur, as if the building were breathing through the walls. It filled the hallways, clung to the wallpaper, pulled in the corners where the light didn't quite reach. At first, I assumed it was the hum of old pipes or a ventilation system struggling to keep pace with the decades. But the longer I listened, the more the sound seemed to have shape and intention, like a soft whispering rising from somewhere deep below or far above. On my first night, I told myself the stories were exaggerations, relics from a time when the hotel was crawling with poets, musicians, addicts, dreamers, people who needed danger or mystique to keep their art alive. Ghosts, I thought, were just metaphors for lives lived too intensely. But the Chelsea doesn't care what you believe. It has its own way of persuading you. I had taken a room on the 5th floor, a narrow space with high ceilings and a window that looked out onto the street. The radiator clanked every few minutes like a metal heartbeat. The walls felt too thin, as if someone had breathed into the plaster over and over for years until it softened. I fell asleep with the window cracked open, hoping the city's noise would drown out whatever unease had begun to settle under my skin. Sometime after midnight, I woke to footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured, as though someone were dragging their feet. I sat up, listening. The steps approached my door, paused outside it, and then continued on, fading into the far end of the corridor. It might have been a guest returning late, except the steps didn't sound quite right. They had no weight to them, no shift of mass, no echo, just the faint scrape of something brushing the floor. The next morning, when I stepped into the hallway, an older woman was shuffling toward the elevator. She had the look of someone who'd lived in the building for years, maybe decades, one of those long-term tenants that Chelsea was famous for. I asked her if there had been someone walking around during the night. She gave me a dry, almost amused smile. "You'll hear all kinds of things here," she said. "Doesn't mean they belong to the living." I laughed politely, but she didn't laugh with me. Instead, she pressed the elevator button and watched me with an expression I couldn't place, part warning, part pity. When the elevator arrived, she stepped inside without another word. The day passed easily enough. I visited friends, wandered the city, tried to convince myself that the previous night's unease had been nothing more than exhaustion mixed with the hotel's eccentric atmosphere. But as evening approached, something in me tightened. The idea of returning to that hallway, that room, made my stomach flutter the way it does before a difficult conversation or an unavoidable truth. Still, I went back. The Chelsea had a way of pulling you toward it, like gravity. That night, the footsteps returned. Again they approached my door. Again they paused. Again they moved on. But this time, there was something else. A faint smell drifting under the door. Perfume, old-fashioned, powdery, the kind you imagine in glass bottles on a dressing table. The scent lingered for a moment longer than made sense, then receded like a whisper pulled away by unseen hands. I lay awake for hours, listening to the building. The radiator hissed. The pipes moaned. Somewhere far off, a door slammed. The murmuring behind the walls grew clearer, as if voices were rising beneath the surface, distinct but indecipherable. Not quite language, not quite noise, something in between. People used to say that Chelsea absorbed the lives of those who stayed there, the artists who overdosed, the musicians who collapsed under their own talent, the lovers who destroyed each other, the ones who fell, the ones who vanished, the ones who burned too bright and then flickered out, their stories soaked into the building like spilled ink. I didn't believe that then, not fully, but lying awake in the dark, I began to feel as though the walls were saturated with more than paint and plaster. As if the place held memories the way a body holds scars. On my third night, I woke again, but not to footsteps. This time, it was the sound of someone crying. It came from the hallway, a soft, fragile sobbing. I listened, unsure whether to open the door or stay where I was. The crying grew louder, filled with something raw and broken. Finally, I got up, walked to the door, and opened it just a crack. The hallway was empty. But the crying continued, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. It seemed to float through the air, drifting past me, down the hall, beyond the stairwell. It wasn't just sadness I heard, it was despair. A despair so profound, it made my throat tighten, made me want to reach for someone who wasn't there. I closed the door, leaned against it, and breathed until the sound faded. That was the moment something shifted in me. I no longer believed I was hearing ordinary noises. The building was speaking, or remembering, or reliving something it had witnessed too many times. The next day, I found myself lingering in the lobby, observing the people who came and went. The Chelsea attracts a certain kind of person, those who aren't afraid of the strange or those who are too desperate to care. A man with paint on his sleeves argued with the desk clerk about a lost key. A woman wearing sunglasses indoors muttered to herself as she paced near the staircase. A young couple carried guitars, their voices bright and brittle with the optimism of people who haven't yet been disappointed by the world. And then there were the others. The ones who barely seemed to register the present, their eyes fixed on something only they could see. Residents who had been there too long, who looked like they'd merged with the building in some intangible way. I wondered how many of them had heard what I had heard, how many pretended they hadn't. I went back to my room and stood by the window, looking down at the street. The city felt solid from up there, cars moving, people crossing, life pulsing along in its usual relentless way. But inside the Chelsea, time felt layered, as if the past and present were pressed so closely together that their edges blurred. That night, I decided not to sleep. I sat on the bed with the lamp on, waiting. Midnight passed quietly. Then one. Then two. The hotel grew still, settling into its nocturnal rhythm. And then, just as I expected, the footsteps began. This time, I didn't freeze. I walked to the door, pressed my ear against it, and listened. The steps approached slowly, deliberately. When they stopped outside my room, I felt a coldness seep through the wood, as if something stood inches from me. I waited, expecting the steps to move on as they always had, but they didn't. Instead, there was a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping like fingernails against the door. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, steady and patient. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. I simply waited, caught between the urge to open the door and the instinct to hide from whatever was on the other side. The tapping stopped abruptly. The footsteps resumed, moving away until they disappeared. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unsure whether the hotel had shown me something or warned me of something. The next morning, I found a small smudge on the outside of my door. A faint, dark streak, as if something had brushed against it. I touched it with the edge of my sleeve. It smeared easily. Dust? Dirt? Something else? I didn't know, and I chose not to investigate further. I should have checked out that day. I should have packed my things and left the hotel behind like a strange dream. But the Chelsea has a way of pulling you deeper into its orbit the more you try to resist. Curiosity mixed with dread. Something in me wanted answers, or at least acknowledgement. I wanted to understand what the building held and why it seemed to notice me. That evening, as I walked through the lobby, the older woman from the hallway appeared again. She approached me without hesitation, her expression tight. "You need to leave," she said. I asked her why. "Because this place remembers." Her voice trembled slightly, and once it starts remembering you, it doesn't forget. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned away before I could. She shuffled toward the elevator, leaving me alone with her words clinging to me like wet clothing. That night was my last. I didn't mean for it to be, but the hotel decided for me. I lay in bed, half awake, listening to the building shift around me. The footsteps came again, but this time they stopped, not at my door, but inside my room. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, but I could feel a presence beside the bed. A pressure in the air, a weight. The scent of old perfume filled my nose. I didn't see anything, not directly, but I sensed movement, as if someone were leaning over me, watching. My breath caught. I couldn't move. My body had become a stone sinking into the mattress. The presence lingered for a moment that stretched far too long, and then, slowly, it receded. The air lightened. The scent faded. My body thawed. I got up immediately, packed my things, and left the room without looking back. I checked out at the front desk with shaking hands. The clerk didn't seem surprised. I wondered how many guests had left in the middle of the night for reasons they couldn't put into words. When I stepped outside, the city felt different. Louder, brighter, harsher, but unmistakably alive. The Chelsea loomed behind me, its windows dark and watchful. I walked away quickly, afraid that if I hesitated, the building might call me back. I never returned. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, familiar, and every now and then, a trace of old perfume drifts through the air, gone before I can confirm it was ever there. People say the Chelsea is haunted because of all the tragedies it has held. Artists who died young, lovers who met violent ends, lives that unraveled behind locked doors. Maybe that's true. Maybe every sorrow leaves a residue, an imprint that lingers long after the body has gone. But I think it's something else. I think that Chelsea is less a haunted house than a living one, a vessel for every story that ever unfolded inside it. A place that absorbs the dreams and nightmares of its residents, storing them in its bones until they become indistinguishable from the building itself. And once it has your story, once it has even a piece of it, it does not let go, not entirely.